They say a man's final moments reveal what he valued most. Some cling to prayer, some to mercy, some to the faint hope that history will forget what they became. But on a wind-bitten morning in the old imperial capital, a condemned scholar stood before a pyre built not of logs, but of his life's work, thousands of pages of forbidden truth. His manuscripts rustled like dying leaves as the executioner soaked them in oil. The crowd whispered his name with a fearful mix of admiration and dread, for only one crime had ever warranted such a symbolically cruel death. He had tried to rewrite history, not with a sword, but with the dangerous honesty of ink. This is the story of a man who believed that truth could outlive kings. A man who discovered, far too late, that power does not fear weapons, it fears memory. And on the day the pyre was lit, and the flames curled around the fragile edges of his forbidden manuscripts, he realized that the empire did not merely want to end his life. It wanted to erase his voice. Before we descend into this tragic and unsettling journey of brilliance, pride, and betrayal, consider joining this channel's growing community. If you value dark history, human stories, and the forgotten tragedies buried beneath empires, then subscribe, like, and stay with me until the final ember fades. Now let us begin. The first memories he carried into adulthood were not of toys or games or childish laughter, but of paper, thin, brittle paper that smelled of dust and secrets. He was born in a remote province where the empire's reach felt like a distant shadow, yet its rules were carved into everything. Even the wind seemed to know what was forbidden. In this quiet corner of the realm, books were rare enough to be traded for livestock, and truth was something whispered only inside locked rooms. His father worked long hours in the grain storehouse. His mother bent over washing stones by the river, and neither could understand why their son stared for hours at the empire's tattered textbooks, as if trying to peel back the ink to see what had been hidden beneath it. The local school was little more than a sagging hut with cracked windows that rattled whenever the northern winds swept down from the mountains. Inside, students hunched over wooden desks that had been carved by generations of restless hands. Their teacher, an old man whose back had bent from years of bowing to officials, recited the approved chronicles in a voice stiff with caution. He never looked directly at his pupils when he reached the more questionable events in imperial history. Those lines shaded in reverence, those battles too glorious to believe, those rebellions too neatly defeated. The young scholar noticed this. Even at 10, he could sense that silence was often more informative than words. It was during one of those quiet afternoons, when sunlight angled through the dusty windows, that he first asked the question that changed the course of his life. "Master," he said softly, "why does the empire claim victory in a war that the northern people say they won?" The teacher froze. A single bead of sweat rolled down his temple. He glanced at the door, as if the officials might burst through it at any moment. Then, without a word, he struck the boy's desk sharply with his cane. "Repeat only what is written," he ordered. "Written truth is the only truth that matters." But even in his trembling voice, the boy heard the truth he was not supposed to hear, the fear behind the ink. From that day onward, he read everything differently. He began noticing the awkward gaps in the empire's chronicle, the suspicious erasures, the names of generals who appeared abruptly and vanished even more abruptly. He asked questions no one dared answer. His curiosity was not born of rebellion, but of hunger. The hunger to understand the world as it truly was, not as the empire painted it. Late one evening, while the village slept, a traveling trader arrived at their home, a weary man with mud on his boots and a canvas bag slung across his shoulder. He had dealt with the boy's father for years, exchanging spices for grain. But that night, he carried something else, something dangerous. After a hesitant glance toward the window, he unwrapped a parcel of manuscripts, their edges frayed, their ink faded by time. "These are not for sale," the trader muttered, "but for safekeeping until I reach the capital. They hold truths the empires try to bury. No child should see them. No man should keep them." He paused, then added, "But I need a place where imperial patrols won't think to search." The boy's father hid the manuscripts beneath the floorboards, imagining them as nothing more than contraband that would pass through his hands quickly. But the boy had already seen the glow in the trader's eyes, the mixture of fear and reverence that only forbidden knowledge could evoke. That night, after the household fell silent, he crept from his bed. His fingers trembled as he pried up the floorboard. Beneath it, the manuscripts lay like sleeping serpents. He touched one lightly, and the world seemed to shift. The pages were filled with accounts of lost cities, censored generals, vanished uprisings, and ancient treaties that contradicted every imperial decree he had memorized in school. These were not the empire's official stories. These were the raw, unfiltered histories of people who had lived, suffered, fought, and been erased. Every paragraph felt like a window that had been nailed shut for generations and was finally opening. He read until his eyes burned. The next morning, he returned to his studies with a new kind of silence, a silence not born of obedience, but of awareness. For the first time, he saw his teacher not as a gatekeeper of knowledge, but as a prisoner of it. He understood why the man's hands trembled during lessons. The empire was not afraid of enemies. It was afraid of memory. As he grew older, his relationship with truth became a kind of private devotion. He sought out smugglers, archivists, wandering monks, anyone who possessed fragments of the forgotten. His teachers warned him that curiosity was a kind of treason. His parents begged him to abandon the path before it consumed him. But something in him refused to surrender. Perhaps it was pride, perhaps destiny, or perhaps the haunting realization that once you glimpse the cracks in a lie, you cannot force yourself to believe it again. And so the boy who once questioned a single line of imperial history began walking toward a future where every step brought him closer to danger. He could not yet see the pyre that awaited him. He could not smell the smoke that would one day swallow his life's work. All he knew was that a story had been stolen from the world, and he intended to return it, whatever the cost. The city's walls rose like frozen thunder, ancient stones drenched in the echo of countless empires. Within these walls, the archives of the realm lay hidden, a labyrinth of narrow corridors, dust-thick air, and shells that groaned beneath the weight of centuries. Candles flickered along the walls, casting shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own, and the faint smell of mildew mixed with the acrid tang of ink, searing itself into the memory of anyone who dared enter. The scholar, now a young man, stepped cautiously into this sacred hall, heart pounding, as if he were trespassing not merely against rules, but against time itself. Every scroll he touched whispered secrets that had been buried by kings, generals, and historians who feared that truth could topple thrones. Some told of rebellions swiftly crushed and never recorded. Others chronicled massacres of entire villages, names crossed out with a deliberate cruelty that felt personal. As he read, he imagined the lives behind the ink, the children who had died from famine and fire, the women who had been cast into rivers to silence their cries, the soldiers whose bravery had been scrubbed from memory. Each story he uncovered was a muted scream echoing across centuries, and the scholar felt both reverence and despair. He had entered a sanctuary of truth, and yet it was a sanctuary laced with danger. It was in the back corridors, where the light of candles barely reached, that he began piecing together fragments that did not align with the empire's official narrative. He found accounts of generals who had vanished from the royal histories, of treaties erased as if they had never existed, of entire provinces reimagined in the official records as obedient and serene. Every contradiction was a spark. Every spark was fuel for a fire that might consume him. And yet, he could not stop. Each parchment held a piece of a puzzle, a fragment of a world that had been systematically silenced. With trembling hands, he transcribed them in his own manuscripts, careful to hide them within false bottoms, secret folds, and hollowed beams. But the archives were not a neutral place. The custodians of memory, the librarians and clerks, watched him with subtle suspicion, eyes narrowing when he lingered too long over certain texts, when he made notes too meticulously, or when his questions hinted at forbidden curiosities. In the beginning, he thought himself clever enough to avoid notice. Yet the whispers began, almost imperceptible at first. Footsteps echoed behind him, shadows fell over his shoulder, and the faintest murmur would trail his movements like a wisp of smoke. The empire had always feared that knowledge could spark rebellion. And in these halls, among the dust and ink, he was becoming dangerous. As months turned into years, he amassed a collection that rivaled the archives themselves. His manuscripts grew thicker, written in meticulous script, each word chosen with care. He wrote not for glory, but for preservation. If the empire erased a truth, he would carry it forward. If a people were erased, he would remember them. The risks were mounting, yet he could not turn back. The thrill of discovery mingled with a creeping dread, the recognition that at any moment, suspicion could become accusation, and accusation could become death. The first warning came quietly, almost like a sigh. A fellow scholar, ostensibly a friend, began asking oddly specific questions. Where did you find that passage? Are you sure the chronicle is authentic? At first, he brushed it aside. Then came the quiet notes slipped beneath his door, warnings disguised as advice. Careful. Curiosity is not a virtue here. It is a crime. The young scholar laughed at the threat, but the laughter did not reach his eyes. Somewhere in the shadows, the empire was watching. Somewhere in the hidden corners of the archives, a record of his movements was being made, a silent ledger of transgression that would one day serve as evidence of his guilt. And yet, even as the danger grew, he could not resist the lure of forbidden knowledge. One evening, while the sun dipped behind the high spires and shadows pooled in the corners of the archives, he uncovered a set of documents that shook him to his core. They were reports of entire towns erased from tax records, evidence of atrocities buried so deeply that no living historian could have reconstructed them. He felt a surge of both triumph and horror. These were the truths the empire feared most, and he held them in his hands. But the thrill was quickly eclipsed by fear. How long could he continue before the shadows closed in? How long before curiosity became death? By the time he left the archives each night, he was no longer merely a student of history. He was its rebel, its secret keeper, its living memory. The streets outside were quieter than the halls he had left behind, yet somehow more dangerous. Every glance from a passerby seemed loaded with suspicion. Every knock at the door could carry betrayal. And somewhere in the corridors of power, the first faint whispers of his name began to circulate. His discoveries would not remain secret forever. The Empire had not yet moved against him, but it had begun its watchful wait, and he, like a moth circling a candle, moved ever closer to the flame. In that tense, uneasy twilight, the young scholar realized something profound. Knowledge was not a neutral power. It was a responsibility, a peril, and a weapon, and he had chosen, willingly, to wield it against an empire that brooked no opposition. Every manuscript he hid, every contradiction he exposed, every truth he preserved, brought him closer to a reckoning he could already sense, but could not yet see. The flame was coming, and when it arrived, the empire would not merely demand his obedience, it would demand his erasure. The knock on the scholar's door came at midnight, sharp and unrelenting, echoing through the narrow streets like the hammer of fate itself. Rain sluiced down the rooftops, hammering the cobblestones with a rhythm that felt almost ceremonial. He knew before opening that the empire had finally arrived. There was no subtlety in the way the guards entered, torches flaring, boots slapping wet stone, the metallic scent of iron from their chains mingling with the scent of his own fear. He was seized before he could protest, the weight of inevitability pressing against his chest as the city's shadowed streets became a blur outside his vision. They did not bring him to the palace at once. No, the empire is never in a hurry to deliver its judgment. First came the interrogation chambers, cold and damp, the air thick with the smell of soot and despair. Here, the empire's cruelty was patient. They stripped him of belongings, letters, and papers, leaving him with nothing but the clothes on his back and the memory of the manuscript he had so carefully hidden. He was questioned about every text, every page, every fragment he had taken from the archives. Each answer he gave was measured, yet the interrogators found flaws in even the most meticulous responses. His knowledge, once a source of pride, became the chain that bound him. The empire's agents moved with quiet precision, and soon the scholar understood that his own students, colleagues, and even members of his family were being compelled to testify against him. They spoke of him as a traitor, a man seduced by ambition and dangerous ideas. His mother's voice, once warm with reassurance, trembled as she called him a fool. His students whispered confessions of imagined loyalty, afraid that any hesitation would cost them their lives. The scholar's heart broke with every accusation, but he did not weep. He had known that the pursuit of truth carried its price, and he had accepted it long before the first torch lit the hallways of the archives. In the solitude of his cell, he wrote. By the dim candlelight, he poured ink onto paper, scribbling every truth he had unearthed, every contradiction he had discovered, every life erased from the empire's history. He wrote not to save himself. He knew that would be impossible, but to ensure that the memory of the silenced might survive. Each stroke of the quill was a defiance, a small rebellion against the inevitable. The manuscripts grew thicker, their pages brimming with stories that the empire would rather burn than see preserved. Every word was a heartbeat, and every heartbeat was a dagger aimed at the empire's attempt to control memory. But betrayal is the most predictable weapon of a despotic state. Among the prisoners, a man with silver hair and a too-friendly smile betrayed the location of the hidden manuscripts. In an instant, the empire's agents descended upon the secret compartments he had crafted with care over years. Scrolls were torn from the shadows, papers scattered across stone floors, and the scholar could only watch as the tangible embodiment of his life's work was seized. The betrayal was complete, the manuscripts no longer his to protect. The emperor, a man both shrewd and cruel, decreed a punishment as symbolic as it was terrifying. The scholar would die, yes, but his death alone was insufficient. His manuscripts, the embodiment of his defiance, the vessels of every forbidden truth, would be burned in his presence. This was not merely execution. It was the empire's declaration that knowledge could be extinguished alongside its keeper. When the day arrived, the pyre was constructed in the central courtyard, a platform of iron and stone upon which his life's labor would be fed to flame. The crowd gathered, hushed but attentive, aware that they were witnessing not just a man's death, but a performance designed to strike fear into the hearts of all who might question imperial authority. The scholar was brought forward, shackled, and surrounded by the pages he had cherished. The smell of ink, once comforting, was now acrid with smoke. As the flames licked the edges of the manuscripts, he felt their warmth against his skin, a cruel mockery of the fire that would consume his body. He closed his eyes, imagining the histories he had preserved, imagining them surviving somewhere, in secret, beyond the empire's reach. In that moment, he understood that death cannot erase memory, nor can tyranny fully destroy the human spirit. As the pyre blazed, his voice was swallowed by crackling flames and the murmur of the crowd. Yet in his mind, the manuscripts continued to speak. Names erased from chronicles cried out again. Lost cities whispered their stories. Forgotten battles and unsung heroes demanded recognition. Though the empire sought to silence him, the scholar had achieved something the emperor could not. He had reminded the world that truth, no matter how carefully hidden or violently suppressed, has a way of enduring. The courtyard still smoked long after the scholar's body had been removed, the embers of his manuscripts curling into the chill morning air like ghostly fingers. The empire had intended spectacle, obedience, terror, but what remained was something else entirely, a lingering sense of awe, of unfinished stories clawing their way through the ashes. Whispers began almost immediately, subtle at first, carried from one scholar to another, from one archivist to another. He wrote what could not be erased. They said in hushed tones, "The empire may burn the pages, but it cannot burn the knowledge inside men's minds." And so the quiet rebellion began, not with swords, but with memory. In distant provinces, students of the late scholar began to meet in secret, copying fragments of recollected manuscripts on whatever they could find, scraps of cloth, strips of bark, the blank margins of official records. Each word was smuggled, memorized, and passed along in whispers, a fragile chain that defied the iron reach of the empire. The very act of remembering became an act of resistance. The scholar, even in death, had become a lodestone for those who refused to let history bend solely to the will of rulers. It was ironic, cruel, and profoundly poetic. The empire had sought to erase him completely, yet in doing so, it had amplified his influence far beyond what he could have imagined. Legends began to circulate almost immediately. Some claimed that on the night of the burning, fragments of manuscripts had survived the flames, carried off by servants loyal to the memory of the scholar. Others whispered that the smoke itself had somehow preserved the words, curling in the wind to land in the hands of those brave enough to read them. Stories spread of clandestine libraries, hidden beneath inns, monasteries, and the floors of private homes, where forbidden histories were read aloud by candlelight. Each telling preserved not just the facts, but the spirit of defiance that had animated the scholar's life. His execution, intended as final, had become a catalyst, igniting a quiet but unyielding hunger for truth. Meanwhile, the empire itself could not shake the tremors left by the scholar's legacy. Officials who had carried out his condemnation began to report anomalies. Townsfolk questioning edicts, scholars citing unknown sources, whispers of truths that had not yet been rewritten. Panic rippled through the corridors of power. The emperor, in his arrogance, had believed that extinguishing one man and his manuscripts would ensure compliance for centuries. Instead, he had unleashed the realization that truth, once glimpsed, cannot be fully contained. And somewhere, in the hidden corners of the capital, the ember of rebellion glowed, fueled not by armies, but by memory and courage. Historians in later generations would debate what was fact and what was legend. Some claimed the manuscript survived only in fragments, scattered across the empire, barely legible and dangerously incomplete. Others argued that the scholar's final words, spoken to the wind as the flames consumed his life's work, had been carried into exile, preserved in secret diaries and oral traditions. Yet all agreed on one thing. His execution, meant to extinguish him, had instead ensured that he would never be forgotten. The empire could erase bodies, burn pages, and rewrite decrees, but it could not erase the human impulse to remember, to record, to testify. The scholar had become immortal not in life, but in memory. Even today, centuries later, scholars speak of him with reverence, tinged with fear. They see in his story the fragile line between knowledge and power, between obedience and conscience, between survival and the duty to bear witness. His manuscripts, lost or hidden, burned or smuggled, continue to haunt the imagination of those who dare to question the official story. And in the quiet moments, when libraries are still, when candles flicker and the air smells faintly of ink and parchment, it is said that the scholar's voice can still be heard, a whisper through time, urging the living to see, to remember, and to defy. The empire sought to claim eternity through the erasure of one man, yet eternity was claimed by the very act it had tried to punish. In the end, the scholar's life, his suffering, and the cruel beauty of his death became a mirror, reflecting the eternal struggle between truth and power. And as new generations uncover fragments of forbidden histories, they are reminded that memory can outlast tyranny, that courage can survive fire, and that even in ashes, a voice can refuse to disappear. If this journey through tragedy, courage, and forbidden knowledge stirred something in you, I want to hear it. Drop your thoughts, reflections, or even your own questions about history in the comments below. Share which story of defiance or forgotten truth you wish we'd explore next. Every suggestion becomes part of our collective memory, and your voice matters as much as the scholars did centuries ago. And if you want to continue uncovering the untold, the haunting, and the tragic corners of history, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the notification bell. Join a community that refuses to let the flames of the past die quietly. Every click, every comment, every share ensures that the stories that empires tried to bury will live on, immortal in memory, eternal in curiosity. Because history is not just what they wrote, it's what we remember.